Imagine the scene: a peaceful park, the gentle sound of leaves rustling in the wind, until something disrupts the calm. A group of bullies surrounds a defenseless boy, with no one around seeming to care. But then, suddenly, an unexpected hero appears. Not a caped superhero, but a homeless man, with a big heart, who decides he won't just stand by. He steps in, confronts the aggressors, and saves the boy, even though there are no guarantees for his own safety. What he doesn't know, however, is that this courageous act will change his life in ways he could never imagine. Because the boy's father soon arrives, and that changes everything. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories with unexpected twists and life-changing moments, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. David woke up that morning to the distant sound of traffic, birds singing in the nearby trees, and the cold breeze that always heralded the beginning of another day. His routine was simple: wake up, gather his few belongings, and head to the park, where he usually spent part of the day observing people, always alert to the movements around him. That morning, however, something caught his attention. A group of teenagers, laughing loudly, was surrounding a younger boy. At first, David just watched, his mind trained to stay out of trouble. But when he saw one of the teens push the boy, something inside him shifted. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" David's voice echoed through the park, surprising even himself. The three teenagers turned around, startled to see this man who, despite his worn appearance, stood with a firm and determined posture. "Who are you, old man? Mind your own business. This has nothing to do with you," one of the boys sneered. David, with his calm gaze, took a few steps forward, placing himself between the boy and the bullies. "It is my business now. Leave the kid alone." His tone was calm but carried a firmness that made it clear he wouldn't back down. The teens exchanged uncertain glances, while the young boy, still frightened, looked at David as if he were an unexpected hero. "You don't know who you're messing with, old man," the leader of the group continued, trying to keep control of the situation. But David, with his life experience, knew that bravado meant nothing without real courage behind it. "I may not know who you are, but you have no idea what I've been through," he replied, his eyes locked on the boys. He could feel fear trying to seep in, but he stood his ground. Years of struggling on the streets, facing adversities that few could imagine, had given him a courage that wouldn't easily break. The teens hesitated, and that was enough for David to know they wouldn't advance. Thomas, the surrounded boy, began to back away, taking advantage of the opening David had created. "It's okay, kid. Go home, I'll handle this," David said, not taking his eyes off the aggressors. Thomas, still trembling, ran away, looking back one last time as if wanting to remember the face of the man who had helped him without expecting anything in return. The bullies, realizing they had lost control, began to retreat too, muttering insults as they left. David stayed there, standing, watching until they disappeared from sight, feeling a mix of relief and a strange sadness. With the teenagers out of sight, David allowed himself to take a deep breath, releasing the tension he had held onto for so long. "Another day, another battle won," he murmured to himself as he bent down to pick up his worn backpack. He knew that, to many, that act of courage might seem small, insignificant even. But to him, every gesture of kindness, every choice to intervene and help, was a victory against the darkness that so often threatened to engulf his life. "At least one good thing happened today," he thought as he started to walk again. Just as David was about to leave the park, he heard footsteps running towards him. He turned around, expecting trouble again, but it was Thomas, the boy he had defended. "Hey, wait!" The boy stopped, out of breath, with a look that mixed fear and gratitude. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up." David smiled, a sincere smile that carried the weight of many untold stories. "Don't worry, kid. Sometimes, we just need someone to remind us we're not alone." Thomas's father, Robert Wilson, arrived shortly after, worried and relieved at the same time to see his son safe and sound. When he saw David, he frowned, trying to understand what had happened. "What were you doing with my son?" Robert asked, a mix of distrust and curiosity in his voice. David, unperturbed, calmly explained what had occurred, without embellishments, just the facts. Robert looked him up and down, as if trying to fit this man into some category he could comprehend. "I just did what I thought needed to be done," David concluded, not expecting any thanks. As Robert processed what he had heard, Thomas tugged at his father's jacket sleeve, whispering something that made the man look at David in a different way. You really helped my son," Robert said, sounding even more confused. He hadn't expected someone in David's situation, someone he clearly saw as marginalized, to be capable of such a selfless act. "Yes, sir. And I would do it again if I had to," David replied, his tone firm but calm. That moment for him wasn't about recognition, but about reaffirming something he had always believed, that everyone, regardless of their circumstances, can make a difference in someone else's life. The silence that followed was thick, laden with thoughts and unspoken prejudices. Robert, still processing everything, finally extended his hand. "I'm Robert Wilson. Thank you for protecting my son." David hesitated for a moment but then shook the offered hand, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and discomfort. "David," he replied simply, his voice almost a whisper. Robert seemed to want to say more but was interrupted by Thomas, who started recounting what had happened, animatedly, as if David were a hero straight out of a fairy tale. David listened to the boy with a discreet smile, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He knew that moment wouldn't change his life drastically, but it was a reminder that, despite everything, he still had the power to choose, to do good, to be more than the circumstances life had imposed on him. "If you need anything, you can find me," Robert said, still unsure of how to proceed. David just nodded, knowing that this kind of offer, though well-intentioned, rarely materialized. He didn't expect charity, just the chance to keep living with dignity. As he walked away, David felt a weight lift off his shoulders, as if that small act of kindness had given him a new perspective. Maybe things can get better, he thought, a spark of hope lighting up in his weary heart. He knew the road ahead would be long and full of obstacles, but for a brief moment, he felt like he had the strength to keep fighting. The park, which had once seemed just a place to pass the time, was now the setting of a small personal miracle, an unexpected twist he hadn't seen coming. And with that in mind, he moved on, unaware that this encounter would change more than just one boy's life. Robert Wilson arrived at the park, his mind preoccupied with work and the daily rush. He was used to dealing with complex situations, being a prominent lawyer in the city, but nothing prepared him for the scene he encountered. His son, Thomas, was talking animatedly with a man dressed in worn clothes, his face marked by the harsh realities of street life. Robert's instinctive reaction was to rush forward, his heart pounding with concern. "Thomas, come here," he called, his voice carrying a mixture of urgency and fear. The boy hesitated for a moment, but then ran to his father, leaving David standing alone, watching the interaction unfold. Robert pulled his son into a protective embrace, his eyes narrowing as he turned his attention to David. "What were you doing with my son?" The question hung in the air, heavy with suspicion. David, sensing the tension, raised his hands slightly in a gesture of peace. "I wasn't doing anything, sir. I just saw him being bullied and stepped in to help." His voice was calm, but there was a weariness in it, the kind that comes from having to justify your existence time and time again. Robert studied him, still on edge, his mind racing through worst-case scenarios. "Thomas, breaking free from his father's grasp, chimed in. "Dad, he saved me. Those kids were being mean, and he made them leave." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and it gave Robert pause. He glanced at his son, then back at David, struggling to reconcile the image of this ragged man with the hero his son described. "Is that true?" Robert asked, his tone softening just slightly. David nodded, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, sir. I couldn't just stand by and watch." The simplicity of his words, combined with the quiet strength in his demeanor, disarmed Robert, if only a little. There was a moment of silence, an awkward pause where both men seemed to be weighing each other. Robert, still holding Thomas's hand, took a deep breath, his professional composure slipping slightly. "Thank you," he said finally, the words sounding strange even to his own ears. It wasn't often that he found himself thanking strangers, especially those who seemed to have nothing to offer in return. But here he was, faced with a man who had done more for his son in a few minutes than many others had done in a lifetime. David just nodded, his expression calm, almost detached, as if he was used to such fleeting gratitude. Thomas, meanwhile, was tugging at his father's arm, his eyes wide with excitement. "Dad, can we help him? He doesn't have a home." Robert blinked, caught off guard by the directness of his son's request. "Thomas, it's not that simple," he began, but the boy interrupted him. "Why not? You're always helping people, right? Why can't we help him too?" The innocence of the question hit Robert hard. He glanced at David, who stood silently, his face unreadable. It was clear that Thomas had taken a liking to the man, and in his youthful naivety, saw no reason why they couldn't change his life as easily as flipping a switch. David, sensing the awkwardness of the moment, spoke up. "I appreciate the thought, but I'm doing okay. I don't need charity." His tone was firm but kind, as if he were trying to let them both off the hook. Robert felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. He was used to being in control, to solving problems with the stroke of a pen or a decisive word. But this was different. This was personal. He looked at David again, really looked, and for the first time saw not just a homeless man, but a person with a story, with experiences and struggles that he could barely comprehend. "Listen," Robert started, choosing his words carefully, "if you ever need help, I'm a lawyer. I could, maybe, help you find some resources, a job, something." It was a tentative offer, one that felt inadequate even as he made it. David's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Thanks, but I've learned to get by on my own." There was no bitterness in his voice, just a quiet acceptance of a reality that was his alone. Robert felt a surge of frustration, not at David, but at himself, for being unable to bridge the gap between their worlds. Thomas, undeterred, looked up at David with a smile. "Will you come back to the park tomorrow?" David hesitated, glancing at Robert, who gave a slight nod, as if giving permission. "Maybe," David said finally, his voice gentle. "If I'm around." The boy's face lit up, and he gave his father a pleading look. "Dad, can we come too?" Robert hesitated, caught between his protective instincts and his son's earnest request. "We'll see," he said, his voice strained. He wasn't sure how to navigate this new territory, this unexpected intersection of his life and David's. As they parted ways, Robert felt a strange sense of unease. He had spent years building his career, his reputation, his life, all with the belief that he understood the world and his place in it. But today, in a simple park, a man with nothing had shown him a side of humanity that he had long forgotten. David's quiet strength, his refusal to accept pity, his willingness to protect a stranger's child, it all challenged Robert's carefully constructed view of the world. As he watched David walk away, a thought nagged at him, Perhaps there was more he could do, more he should do. Driving home, Robert's mind was filled with conflicting emotions. He glanced at Thomas, who was looking out the window, lost in his own thoughts. "Dad, why do some people have to live like that?" The question was so simple, yet so profound. Robert didn't have an easy answer. "Sometimes life is unfair, Thomas. But that doesn't mean we can't try to help when we can." He realized, even as he said the words, that they sounded hollow. What did it really mean to help? A donation here, a kind word there? Was that enough? Or was he just soothing his own conscience? That night, as he lay in bed, Robert found himself replaying the events of the day over and over. He had spent his life fighting for justice, for fairness, for people who could afford his services. But what about those who couldn't? Was it enough to simply thank a man like David and move on? Or was there something more he could do, some way to make a real difference? As he drifted off to sleep, he felt the stirrings of an idea, a plan that was still vague but beginning to take shape. Tomorrow, he decided, he would find David again. The next day, Robert and Thomas returned to the park, a mixture of curiosity and determination driving them. Robert scanned the area, half expecting that David wouldn't be there, that the encounter from the previous day had been a fleeting, one-time event. But there he was, sitting on a bench, his gaze distant, as if lost in his own thoughts. Thomas, unable to contain his excitement, ran ahead. "David, you came back!" he called out, his voice full of joy. David looked up, surprise and a touch of warmth crossing his face. "Hey, kid. I said I might come back, didn't I?" Robert approached more slowly, his mind racing with thoughts and questions. He had spent the night wrestling with his own conscience, trying to figure out what, if anything, he could do to help this man who had unexpectedly entered his life. "Morning, David," he greeted, his tone a bit stiff but sincere. David nodded, acknowledging him with a calm, steady gaze. "Morning. Didn't think I'd see you two again so soon." There was no accusation in his voice, just a simple statement of fact, as if he had grown used to people coming and going in his life. Thomas immediately launched into a flurry of conversation, talking about school, his favorite cartoons, and everything else that came to his young mind. David listened patiently, a small smile playing on his lips. For a few moments, it was as if they were just any three people having a casual chat in the park. But Robert couldn't shake the feeling that there was a deeper undercurrent here, something more significant than just a chance meeting. He took a deep breath, deciding to push past his own discomfort. "David, I was thinking, maybe we could help you find a more stable situation. A job, a place to stay." David's expression didn't change, but there was a slight tension in his posture. "I appreciate it, Mr. Wilson, but I'm okay. I've been managing just fine on my own." His voice was calm, but there was a firmness to it, a quiet dignity that refused to be pitted. Robert felt a pang of frustration, not at David, but at the situation itself. He had come prepared to offer help, but he was realizing that it wasn't that simple. People like David weren't projects to be fixed. They were individuals with their own stories, their own struggles, and their own pride. Thomas, oblivious to the adult complexities at play, tugged at David's sleeve. "David, you're my friend, right?" The directness of the question caught both adults off guard. David looked down at the boy, his eyes softening. "Sure, kid. I guess we're friends." Thomas beamed, clearly delighted with the answer. "See, Dad. We're friends now. That means we can help each other, right?" Robert couldn't help but smile at his son's innocent logic. "Yes, Thomas. Friends help each other." But he knew that this was more complicated than his son could understand. David, sensing the awkwardness in the air, decided to steer the conversation to safer ground. You know, Thomas, when I was your age, I used to love going to the library. There was this one book, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, that I must have read 100 times. His eyes had a distant look as he spoke, as if remembering a time long past. Have you read it? Thomas shook his head, his face lighting up with curiosity. No, what's it about? David's smile widened. It's about a boy who gets into all sorts of trouble but always finds a way out. It's a story about courage, adventure, and friendship. You'd like it. Robert watched the exchange, his mind turning over what he was witnessing. There was something in the way David spoke to Thomas, a gentleness and wisdom that seemed incongruous with his current circumstances. He realized in that moment that he didn't know anything about this man's past, what had brought him to this point. David, he began cautiously, would you mind telling us a bit about yourself? How you ended up here, I mean. It was a blunt question, but he felt it needed to be asked. David looked at him, his gaze steady and unreadable. For a long moment, it seemed like he wouldn't answer. Then he took a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. It's a long story, Mr. Wilson, but I guess I can give you the short version. He paused, as if searching for the right words. I had a good job, a family, the whole 9 yards. But I made some bad choices, lost everything. Spent years trying to get back on my feet, but life doesn't always cooperate, you know. His voice was calm, almost detached, as if he were telling someone else's story. Ended up on the streets, and here I am, trying to keep going, one day at a time. There was no bitterness in his tone, no self-pity. Just a quiet acceptance of his reality. Robert felt a knot in his stomach as he listened. He had dealt with many cases in his career, seen people in desperate situations, but hearing it firsthand from someone who had helped his own son was different. It made the abstract real, personal. I'm sorry, David. I can't imagine how hard that must have been. David shrugged, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. We all have our battles, Mr. Wilson. Mine just happened to knock me down pretty hard. Thomas, his eyes wide, looked up at David with a new respect. You're really strong, David, he said softly. David chuckled, a sound that was both amused and a little sad. Maybe, kid. Or maybe I'm just too stubborn to quit. Robert found himself smiling despite the somber topic. There was something undeniably compelling about David, a strength of spirit that refused to be broken, no matter how tough things got. It was a quality he admired, and he realized he wanted to do more than just offer platitudes. I have an idea, Robert said suddenly, a plan forming in his mind. How about we meet here every Saturday? We can talk. Maybe I can bring some books for you, Thomas, and we can figure things out together. It was a tentative offer, but it felt right. David looked at him, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. You'd really do that? Robert nodded, feeling a strange sense of purpose. Yes, I would. And I promise, no pressure. Just, let's see what happens. David studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, Mr. Wilson. Let's see what happens. As weeks passed, David's meetings with Robert and Thomas became a regular occurrence. Each Saturday, they would sit together on the same park bench, their conversations ranging from mundane topics to deeper reflections about life and its unpredictable twists. It was during one of these conversations that David opened up about his past, a story filled with ups and downs, hope and despair. He spoke of his childhood in a small town, where he was raised by a single mother who worked tirelessly to provide for him. She was my rock, David said softly, his eyes distant. She taught me about courage and perseverance, but life has a way of testing those lessons. He shared how, after high school, He had joined the military, hoping to build a better future. It was tough, but I felt like I had a purpose, he recalled. I traveled, met people from all over the world. But when I came back, things were different. The transition from military life to civilian life had been jarring. It's like you go from being part of something bigger to feeling completely alone, he said, his voice tinged with a sadness that spoke of many silent struggles. I tried to adjust, got a job in construction, but then the recession hit. Work dried up, and things started to spiral. Robert listened intently, sensing that there was much more beneath the surface of David's calm exterior. I tried everything to keep things together, David continued. Odd jobs, anything to pay the bills. But when my mom got sick, everything else stopped mattering. He paused, his gaze fixed on a distant point as if replaying the events in his mind. I spent all my savings on her treatment, did everything I could, but it wasn't enough. His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat, taking a deep breath before continuing. When she passed, it felt like a part of me went with her. I just lost my way. Thomas, who had been quietly listening, looked up at David with wide eyes. That's so sad, David. I'm really sorry. David smiled gently at the boy, his eyes softening. Thanks, kid. But life goes on, right? We have to keep moving forward, no matter what. There was a resilience in his words, a hard-earned wisdom that Robert found both inspiring and heartbreaking. He had seen many people struggle, but hearing David's story made it painfully clear how easily someone's life could be derailed by circumstances beyond their control. David went on to explain how, after his mother's death, things had gone from bad to worse. He had fallen into a deep depression, and with no family or close friends to support him, he had drifted. I lost my job, my apartment, ended up on the streets. It's a whole different world out there, he said, shaking his head. You're invisible, a ghost in the middle of the city. People look right through you, like you don't even exist. There was no bitterness in his voice, just a quiet resignation that came from living through it. Robert felt a pang of guilt as he realized how often he himself had probably looked past people like David, too caught up in his own world to notice the struggles of others. It must have been terrifying, he said softly. David nodded. Yeah, it was. Still is, sometimes. But you get used to it. You find ways to survive. He spoke of shelters that were overcrowded and dangerous, of nights spent in the cold, of the constant battle to stay safe and find enough to eat. You learn to live on adrenaline, always alert. One wrong move, and you could lose everything you have. Which, to be honest, isn't much. Thomas, still processing everything, asked in a small voice, Didn't anyone help you, David? Like, at all? David smiled at the boy's innocence. Sometimes, yeah. There were a few good people who'd give me a meal or a kind word. But mostly, you're on your own. It's like people are afraid to get too close, as if they might catch whatever bad luck you have. His words hung in the air, a stark reminder of how society often treats its most vulnerable. Robert felt a deep sense of unease, realizing that he had been one of those people, keeping his distance out of fear or discomfort. David continued, his tone reflective. I've tried to get back on my feet. Went to interviews, did everything I could to find work. But once you've been on the streets, people look at you differently. They see the gaps in your resume, the way you look, and they just dismiss you. There was no anger in his voice, just a weary acceptance of the way things were. I get it. They're protecting themselves, their businesses. But it makes it hard to believe things can change, you know? Robert nodded, his mind racing with thoughts of how to help, but knowing that real change would take more than just good intentions. Despite everything, David still held on to a sliver of hope. You know, I've been thinking about taking some classes, learning a trade or something. Maybe start my own business one day, if I can ever save up enough." There was a quiet determination in his voice, a spark of the man he used to be. Robert felt a surge of admiration. "That's a great idea, David. I know it's not easy, but I think you can do it. And if there's anything I can do to help, I will." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and David looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and skepticism. "I appreciate that, Mr. Wilson. I really do. But I've learned not to get my hopes up too much. It's easier that way." His words were laced with a sadness that spoke of too many broken promises, too many times he had dared to hope, only to have it all come crashing down. Robert felt a lump in his throat, the weight of his own privilege and the unfairness of it all pressing down on him. "I understand," he said quietly. "But I want you to know that you're not alone in this. We're in this together, okay?" Thomas, ever the optimist, chimed in. "Yeah, David. We're a team now. You'll see, everything's gonna get better." His youthful enthusiasm was infectious, and David couldn't help but smile. "Thanks, kid. I hope you're right." But even as he spoke the words, he knew that hope was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the harsh realities of the world. Still, he appreciated their presence, the simple act of being seen and heard, of being treated like a person again. It was more than he had felt in a long time. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, they said their goodbyes. David watched as Robert and Thomas walked away, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. He knew better than to get too attached, to start thinking that things might actually change. But there was a part of him, a small, stubborn part, that wanted to believe it was possible. That maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. He took a deep breath, letting it out slowly as he turned to leave. One day at a time, he reminded himself. Just keep going. The following Saturday, Robert arrived at the park with a new sense of purpose. He had spent the entire week thinking about David and his situation, brainstorming ways he could help without imposing. As he approached the usual bench, he saw David already there, his eyes following the movement of the leaves rustling in the breeze. Thomas ran ahead, his energy palpable. "David, guess what? Dad has a surprise for you." The excitement in the boy's voice brought a smile to David's face, though he raised an eyebrow curiously. "A surprise, huh? What is it?" Robert, catching up, took a deep breath before speaking. "David, I've been thinking a lot about what you said last week. About wanting to learn a trade, maybe start your own business someday." He paused, gauging David's reaction. "I know you've probably heard a lot of empty promises before, but I want to do more than just talk. I spoke to a friend of mine who owns a garage downtown. He's willing to give you a chance, a job interview." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, David just stared, as if trying to process what he'd heard. "A job interview?" David echoed, his voice low and measured. It was clear he was trying not to let hope take root too quickly. "Yeah," Robert continued, his tone earnest. "I know it's not much, but it's a start. You mentioned wanting to learn a trade, and this could be a good way to get your foot in the door. My friend is a good guy. He's willing to teach you if you're willing to work hard." There was a tension in the air, an unspoken understanding that this could be a turning point, but only if David chose to take it. David looked at Robert, then at Thomas, who was practically bouncing with excitement. "Dad said you'd be great at it. He says you're really smart and strong." The boy's faith in him was almost overwhelming. David felt a tightness in his chest, emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time rising to the surface. "I don't know what to say," he murmured, his voice cracking slightly. "No one's given me a chance like this in a long time." Robert smiled, a genuine warm smile that made his usually stern face seem almost boyish. "Then say yes. Give it a shot. If it doesn't work out, we'll figure something else out." For a long moment, David was silent, weighing his options. He had learned to be cautious, to guard his heart against disappointment. But looking at Robert and Thomas, seeing their genuine belief in him, he felt something shift inside. "Okay," he said finally, his voice steady. "I'll do it. I'll go to the interview." Thomas let out a cheer, and even Robert looked visibly relieved. "That's great, David. You won't regret it, I promise." There was a lightness to the moment, a feeling of hope that felt almost foreign to David. He wasn't sure how long it would last, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe things could change. The day of the interview arrived, and David found himself standing outside the garage, his heart pounding in his chest. He had borrowed a clean shirt from the shelter, and although it didn't quite fit, it was the best he could do. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The smell of oil and grease was familiar, almost comforting. The owner, a burly man with a kind smile, extended his hand. "You must be David. I'm Frank. Robert told me about you." David shook his hand, feeling a little out of place but determined. "Yes, sir. I'm ready to work hard and learn." Frank nodded, his eyes assessing but not judgmental. "That's good to hear. I'm not going to lie to you, this work is tough, and it doesn't pay much to start. But if you stick with it, you'll learn skills that can take you far." He gestured to the cars in the shop, engines open, tools scattered around. "I started here just like you, and now I run the place. So, if you're willing to put in the effort, I'm willing to teach you everything I know." There was a sincerity in his words that put David at ease. "I'm ready, sir. Just tell me what to do." The first few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. David found himself thrown into a world of engines and tools, learning the ins and outs of car repair. It was hard work, physically demanding and mentally exhausting, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose. He woke up each morning with a reason to get up, a place to go, and a goal to achieve. Frank proved to be a patient teacher, guiding him through each step with a steady hand and a wealth of experience. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, David," Frank said one day as they worked on a particularly stubborn engine. "I can see you going far if you keep at it." David was grateful for the encouragement, but there were still moments of doubt. He knew he had a long road ahead of him, and the fear of failure loomed large. But every time those doubts crept in, he thought of Thomas's eager face, of Robert's belief in him, and it pushed him to keep going. Slowly, he began to find his rhythm, gaining confidence with each passing day. He even started to look forward to the Saturdays at the park, where he would share his progress with Robert and Thomas, their support a steadying force in his life. One Saturday, after finishing a long shift, David met Robert and Thomas at the park. He was tired, his muscles aching, but there was a lightness in his step that hadn't been there before. "How's it going, David?" Robert asked, his eyes searching David's face for any sign of discouragement. "It's going well," David replied, a smile spreading across his face. "I'm learning a lot, and Frank says I'm picking things up faster than he expected." Thomas beamed up at him. "I knew you'd be great. You're like a superhero, David." The boy's admiration was genuine, and David felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. Robert nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm really proud of you, David. I know this isn't easy, but you're doing it. You're making it happen." There was a respect in his voice that meant more to David than any praise he had received in a long time. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I couldn't have done this without your support." Robert shook his head. "You're the one putting in the work, David. "We're just here to cheer you on." It was a simple statement, but it carried a profound truth. David knew that no matter what happened next, he wasn't alone in this journey. As they continued to talk, David felt a sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't out of the woods yet. There were still many challenges ahead. But he had taken the first step, and that was something to be proud of. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was moving forward, not just surviving but living. And with each passing day, that hope, that belief in himself, grew a little stronger. One day at a time, he reminded himself, "Just keep going." As weeks turned into months, David's life began to take on a rhythm that he hadn't experienced in years. He continued working at the garage, learning the trade and gaining respect among his coworkers. But it wasn't just his professional life that was changing. His relationship with Robert and Thomas was growing deeper, shifting from a chance encounter to a genuine friendship. Every Saturday, they met at the park, their conversations flowing more easily as trust built between them. Thomas, with his boundless energy and curiosity, became a constant source of joy for David, a reminder that there were still good things in the world worth holding on to. One Saturday, as they sat on their usual bench, Thomas surprised everyone by bringing a small toolbox with him. "David, look. I got this for you," he exclaimed, his face glowing with excitement. David looked at the toolbox, then back at Thomas, his heart swelling with emotion. "You got this for me?" he asked, his voice thick with surprise. Thomas nodded eagerly. "Yeah. Dad helped me pick it out. I know it's not much, but now you'll have your own tools for work." David felt a lump form in his throat. He had been given things before, clothes, food, even money, but this was different. This was thoughtful, personal, a sign that he was seen and cared for. Robert, standing nearby, smiled softly. Thomas insisted on getting it. He said every mechanic needs his own set of tools. David nodded, unable to find the words to express what he was feeling. "Thank you," he managed, his voice low. "This means more than you know." He reached out and ruffled Thomas's hair, a gesture that had become their familiar routine. Thomas grinned, clearly pleased with himself. "I'm glad you like it. Now you can fix even more cars and be the best mechanic ever." His enthusiasm was infectious, and David couldn't help but laugh, the sound rich and genuine. Their bond continued to grow, and soon, David found himself becoming an important figure in Thomas's life. The boy would share stories from school, ask for help with homework, and even talk about his dreams for the future. David, in turn, shared pieces of his own past, lessons he had learned, and hopes he still held on to. "You know, when I was your age, I wanted to be an engineer," David told him one day as they walked through the park. "I used to take apart my mom's old radio just to see how it worked. Drove her crazy, but I was always curious about how things fit together." Thomas's eyes widened. "An engineer? That's so cool. Do you still want to do that?" David shrugged, a wistful smile on his face. "Maybe. I think it's too late for that now, but working at the garage feels good. It's like I'm building something, piece by piece, just like I used to with those radios." Thomas looked thoughtful, then said, "I think you'd make a great engineer, David. You're really smart." David felt a warmth spread through him. It had been a long time since anyone had believed in him like that, especially a child. "Thanks, kid. That means a lot." Meanwhile, Robert observed the growing bond between his son and David with a mix of gratitude and concern. He was grateful for the positive influence David was having on Thomas, teaching him lessons that went beyond what any classroom could offer. But he also worried about what might happen if things didn't work out for David. He knew the road to stability was a long and uncertain one, and the last thing he wanted was for his son to get hurt if David's progress faltered. One evening, as they packed up to leave the park, Robert pulled David aside. "I just want you to know, David, that we're here for you. No matter what happens." David looked at Robert, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "I appreciate that, Mr. Wilson. I really do. But I don't want to let anyone down." There was a vulnerability in his voice that Robert hadn't heard before. "You won't," Robert assured him. "Just keep doing what you're doing. One day at a time." David nodded, his gaze steady. "One day at a time," he echoed, his mind swirling with thoughts and fears. He knew he had come a long way, but the weight of his past and the uncertainty of his future were constant companions. But knowing he had people who believed in him, who were rooting for him, made all the difference. As time went on, David began to open up more about his past, sharing stories he hadn't told anyone in years. He talked about his mother, his dreams, and the mistakes that had led him to where he was now. It was cathartic, like a burden being slowly lifted from his shoulders. Robert listened, offering words of encouragement and support, while Thomas asked questions, his youthful curiosity bringing a lightness to even the heaviest of topics. It wasn't just about sharing his story, it was about reclaiming it, finding strength in the telling. One Saturday, as they sat together, David said something that caught Robert by surprise. "I've been thinking about taking a night class," he said, his voice tentative. "There's a program at the community center for adults who want to finish their education. I never got my diploma, and I think it's time I did." Robert's face lit up with encouragement. "That's a fantastic idea, David. I'm sure you'll do great." Thomas, bouncing with excitement, added, "Yeah, David, you're the smartest person I know. You'll be the best student ever." David chuckled, feeling a mix of excitement and fear. It had been so long since he had thought about school, about learning. But the more he thought about it, the more it felt like the right step. Robert offered to help with the application process, and soon enough, David was enrolled. His first class was a mix of anxiety and anticipation. As he sat in the small classroom, surrounded by others who were also looking for a second chance, he felt a surge of hope. The instructor, a kind woman in her 50s, welcomed them all, her voice filled with warmth and encouragement. "You're here because you believe in yourself, and that's the first step," she said. David held onto those words like a lifeline, determined to prove to himself, and to the people who believed in him, that he could do this. The weeks flew by, and David found himself thriving in his new routine. He worked at the garage during the day and attended classes at night. It was exhausting, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving forward, building a future instead of just surviving. And through it all, Robert and Thomas were there, cheering him on, celebrating his small victories. It wasn't just about learning, it was about healing, about reclaiming his life one step at a time. One evening, as they sat together in the park, Thomas asked, "David, do you think you'll become an engineer one day?" David looked at the boy, his heart full. "Maybe, kid. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm going to keep trying." Robert nodded, his eyes filled with pride. "That's all any of us can do, David. Keep trying." It was a simple sentiment, but it carried so much weight. David knew there were still challenges ahead, but he also knew he wasn't facing them alone. And that made all the difference. Now that you've followed this entire journey of overcoming challenges, courage, and transformation, it's time to reflect. What would you do if you had the chance to change someone's life? And what if it were your own life that needed a turnaround? David showed us that no matter how hard the path may be, it's never too late to start over, to find hope where there seemed to be none, and, most importantly, to connect with people who inspire us to be better. But what about you? Are you willing to take the next step in your own journey? Maybe it's starting that project you've been postponing, giving someone a second chance, or even changing your attitude towards life. True transformation begins within each of us, and it only happens when we have the courage to act, even when the future is uncertain. So, why not start now? Subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and stay tuned for more stories that inspire and provoke real change. Are you ready to transform your life?